Kol Nidre. This is our evening of judgment. We enter the sanctuary and stand utterly open before God, our loved ones, our most vulnerable selves. The Torah stands as our witness as the Kol Nidre is chanted, and we yearn for something unknowable, inexpressible. We long for some place in the world that is wise, true, just, compassionate, forgiving, safe, secure, even, dare we say, sacred. We open the doors to the ark, searching perhaps for a sense of transcendence. This is my final Kol Nidre as the rabbi, or then senior rabbi of this community. So for me, this Kol Nidre, this Yom Kippur, this entire holy day season has been something different. A life cycle moment, a ritual rite of passage. Transition is in the air, and we know that transition carries with it anxiety. Am I here or there? What is beyond? Religion creates ritual to carry us from one state to another. Kabbalat Shabbat, for example, eases us from the work week to the sacred Shabbat. Havdalah brings us from the ending of Shabbat to the secular world of work and its realities. Transition times are like those cracks in the sidewalk that many people try to avoid. This is a liminal moment, for me anyhow. Therefore, nothing that I will say this evening can possibly capture the thoughts and feelings churning within. I'm sorry for that, because there is so much I would like to express. And with that, I should probably sit down right now. But at the risk of appearing egotistical, something that I quite frankly dread, and then I wonder, do I dread appearing egotistical or being egotistical? I want to try and begin to articulate, even for myself, what it is that I have tried to do here at Micah over these past 41 plus years. Get comfortable. What I sought to avoid clarified much of my thinking. My final year of rabbinical school, autumn 1978, the Chicago White Sox had finished last in the American League Western Division, and the dreaded New York Yankees are playing for the World Series, which they win, and I am in New York. Apologies to all Yankee fans. And I am working on my rabbinical school requirement, the senior sermon. This rabbinical school rite of passage is delivered before the student body and faculty, followed by a lunch discussion and critique offered by that same faculty and student body. It is that greatest of all anxieties, public judgment. Some of the faculty could be withering in their comments. In my era, Eugene Borowitz and Stanley Dreyfus were second to none. My sermon was an articulation of fears of what I might become as a rabbi. I did not want to be what I labeled a Rabbi X. Rabbi X was the kind of rabbi who droned on seamlessly, endlessly, without saying much that seemed to matter. Rabbi X was skilled at combining the ability to sound learned while being irrelevant. Everyone was polite to Rabbi X and treated him, they were almost all hymns in those days, respectfully, but no one took Rabbi X very seriously, or no one took him as seriously as he took himself, which would have been impossible anyhow. I didn't want to be Rabbi X, that much I knew. What I did not know was what I wanted to be. But I was certain that Judaism was important, that being Jewish could be life-defining and life-informing, that Judaism was huge and wise and smart and complicated and like life itself contradictory, Judaism is both the weekday and Shabbat. It is Kodesh and Chol. It is Yom Kippur, but it's also tomorrow. It's the life cycle and the yearly cycle. Judaism is as formulaic as Baruch Atah Adonai and as incomprehensible as the Yerushalmi, Spinoza, Rosenzweig, or Levinas. You can take your choice. Judaism is anything but trivial, yet synagogue life, from my vantage point as a rabbinical student, appeared so often to be a kind of decorative afterthought. As a student, I was not at all sure how the Judaism I was studying added up to what I was supposed to be or do as a rabbi. On top of that, and what I will say now sounds truly unbelievable, especially to me, but this is true, this is totally true. In my 5 years of study at the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Jerusalem and New York City, there was not one course that I took or was offered on Reform Judaism. There was not one course on the history of Reform Judaism, the theology of Reform Judaism. There was no studying the origins of Reform Judaism in Europe. There was no study at all of American Reform Judaism. There was not one offering or discussion on the sociology of American Jewish life. There was no modeling on how a worship service should be led. There was no conversation about a Reformed Jewish sense of Shabbat. I could tell you about the rabbinical legal principle, a complicated one at that, of the migo, which relates to the believability of someone who confesses to a crime and the responsibility of the rabbinic court to accept such testimony. But I experienced no such discussion whatsoever, for example, on the role of Jewish law in Reform Judaism. What, for example, did we mean when we said that we are a non-halachic movement? Nary a clue. No one asked us to consider how we thought about God. No conversations about our personal Jewish beliefs or commitments. I was ordained a rabbi on June 10th, 1979. I think I embodied the wisdom that was offered about the founder of the Hebrew Union College, Isaac Mayer Wise, who in 1875 first opened the doors of the school in Cincinnati. It was said of Rabbi Wise that he sought to create a school to serve the needs of 19th century American Jews. As I held my ordination diploma, my smicha certificate in Midtown Manhattan on that beautiful spring day, I think I agreed that Rabbi Wise had succeeded in his goal. I was most prepared to be a rabbi for 19th century Jews. I had no real sense of how I might meet the late 20th century. I thus stepped from rabbinical school into the world. There is a wisdom that teaches that all theology is autobiography. I therefore am regularly inspired by a sentence in Micah member Ariel Sabar's beautiful book, My Father's Paradise, A Son's Search for His Family's Past. He writes, one sentence, quote, "We are who we come from as much as who we make of ourselves," end of quote. As I consider what I have tried to do at Micah, I keep coming back to three pivotal people. My father, my grandfather, who Micah knows as Grandpa Goldman, and of course, my teacher, mentor, rabbi, and dear friend, Larry Hoffman. My father was a model of modesty and self-confidence. He was a totally self-made man, an expression that has fallen out of use. He quietly worked his way through college and law school. No one ever paid any bill for him. One year, when I was probably 11 or 12, on the way home from summer camp, I asked my father where he had gone to summer camp. My mother's response, "Dad went to Camp Hard Knocks and came out best." She was right. I never heard my father boast about even one accomplishment. Pirkei Avot asks, Ezehu Ashir, Hasameach Bechelko, who is wealthy, one who is happy with his portion. My dad was the happiest person in the world, and I never saw him afraid of anything. When I look back and think about all of the ongoing challenges to being a rabbi in a congregation, I know that my father's self-confidence was speaking to me with every unpopular and contested decision that I made. In my head and my heart, my dad was and is always in my corner in every tense meeting down to this day. This was the necessary foundation for, if it's not broken, break it. Because I sought here at Micah to create a culture of change, experimentation, thinking outside the box, and then going outside the box and doing it, and not being afraid of things going wrong when something doesn't work. The confidence it takes to be challenged and criticized, get things wrong, and not panic comes from my dad. Grandpa Goldman. My grandfather, Rabbi Solomon Goldman, was among the greatest, but I will say the greatest rabbi in the country in the early years of the 20th century, and I never really knew him. I was 6 months old when he died in 1953 at the too young age of 59. I'm going to be speaking about Grandpa Goldman and teaching from his writings this coming February over a course of a Shabbat, so I'll go very lightly here. I simply want to say that the environment in which his 4 grandchildren and 2 others are here this evening, my sister and my cousin, that the 4 of us were raised in an environment that kept his memory vibrant and very much alive. We all were students in the Anshe Day School, which he founded. My classmates from that school remain among my dearest friends, and Louise will tell you that my knowledge of Hebrew grammar comes from that school. Thank you, Mrs. Dubovic and Mrs. Lebowski. I actually cannot believe the way Hebrew is taught today. I remember Pe'apol, Amid Vav, I mean, the drilling in of the binyanim, I remember from both Mrs. Dubovic and Mrs. Lebowski. And sometimes when I'm walking with Louise, I'll even imitate very, very unkindly the way Mrs. Lebowski used to talk. Growing up in the synagogue that my grandfather led for nearly 25 years, one could literally see his vision, literally. The stained glass windows he commissioned for the Yad Shemet Synagogue of Chicago include a huge depiction of New York Harbor with the Statue of Liberty flanked by giant windows of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. The stained glass window in the dome of the sanctuary has the words, "All men are created equal." Grandpa Goldman was far ahead of his time. His prayer book, the prayer book that he edited, published by the Jewish Publication Society in 1938, contains special readings, not simply from the Bible and rabbinic literature, but also includes Lord Byron, Albert Einstein, Heinrich Heine, Thomas Huxley, Percy Shelley, Rachel Bluestein, otherwise known as Rachel, the great poet of the Yeshuv, and Rebecca Heinemann, to name just a few. This is far more progressive than any comparable Reform movement prayer book of that era. Grandpa's writings on Jewish prayer included the following gem written in 1952, and I took just one sentence out of a correspondence, but this is a great sentence written to someone who was trying to get him to make a contribution to the prayer book that was then being published by his own movement, the conservative movement. He wrote, quote, "The prayer book has to be dynamited, not revised," end of quote. Is this the inspiration for "if it's not broken, break it"? But more about Grandpa Goldman in February. Rabbi Hoffman. Pirkei Avot offers us this wisdom. Aseh lecha rav ukaneh lecha chaver. Acquire for yourself a teacher and make for yourself a friend. In one fell swoop, I managed to do both. This is not the moment for me to wax poetic about my beloved mentor, but I will briefly. Rabbi Hoffman is simultaneously a deep and creative thinker, a patient teacher, a brilliant scholar, and a generous, caring, kind rabbi. He is also extraordinarily passionate about the possibility of what synagogues can be. He inspires. My gift is having this teacher for going on 50 years. Rabbi Hoffman provided not only an ongoing course of study in Jewish liturgy and rabbinic literature, he opened up the field of ritual studies by asking such basic questions as what is prayer, and then pointing out that the correct answer involved not only studying the words of the prayers, but the entire aesthetics of the worship experience. Rabbi Hoffman's study of prayer under the umbrella of ritual studies therefore included the study of poetry, linguistics, theology, music, anthropology, sociology, architecture, philosophy, and more. My father, grandfather, and mentor combined to inform my approach to trying to understand Judaism and then trying to help influence the direction of Micah. I do not know when it first struck me really deeply what those stained glass windows that I saw as a boy in Chicago were trying to tell me. That is why we needed an American Judaism, or what even an American Judaism was. But when I read Yaroslav Pelikan's, for me, remarkable book, The Vindication of Tradition, something clicked. And I actually thought of those windows as I read that book well over 20 years ago. In this book, Pelikan, a scholar of medieval Christianity, examines the role of tradition in culture. It is a critique of postmodern, post-Enlightenment thinking. At one point, Pelikan compares tradition to a ladder that cultures are climbing constantly as they evolve through time. Some postmodern thought, Pelikan claims, seeks to kick away the ladder, leaving it rootless and in peril of being without values. Pelikan proceeds to offer the formulation that urgently rolls around inside of me because he understands the dynamic of what religion is trying to do. So this is a sentence that if you've come on Shabbat morning, you've heard me read half a dozen times, and I love it. So I'm going to read it twice now. Pelikan writes, "Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And I suppose I should add, it is traditionalism that gives tradition such a bad name. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And I suppose I should add, it is traditionalism that gives tradition such a bad name." The goal for me became to take Pelikan's wisdom. He knows everything in 2 sentences. I mean, amazing. The goal for me became to take our inheritance, our tradition, and make it the living faith of the dead. That is a living faith of what has been bequeathed to us by our past. This meant striving to make it alive, which meant, of course, relevant, socially, emotionally, ethically, intellectually. Too much religion, including Reform Judaism, seemed to me to be a form of Pelikan's traditionalism, a dead faith of the living, or synagogue as decoration. This helped me look at puzzle number 2, my ongoing frustration with the study of rabbinic literature, not as an academic discipline. I found it interesting. Why else would I be a rabbi if I didn't like reading this stuff? But as someone who is trying to understand how to be a dynamic living Jew, it posed a huge problem. The questions the traditional commentators asked of the texts never seemed to coincide with my own questions of those texts. My go-to example, the Talmud begins with the famous question, what time do we recite the Shema in the evening? The Talmud is concerned with the range of hours that one has to fulfill the mitzvah reciting the evening Shema. How early? How late? How do you measure when it is evening on a cloudy day? All these questions in an era with no clocks. The Talmud then offers a wide variety of ways to gauge the time to tell if it's too light or if it's too dark, fine. But none of those are my questions because I usually own a watch. I wanted to know, why do we say the Shema? What does saying the Shema mean to the person who was saying it? What does it feel like to say the Shema? What did the ancient rabbis see as the meaning behind the Shema? I've often thought, and I'm going off the text, I didn't write this, the greatest Jewish invention one could ever make would be really a time machine, not for the purpose of science fiction. We could get into the time machine, we could go back to Akiba, and we could say to Akiba after he just finished saying the Shema, can you tell me what that felt like? What that felt like. I could then get back in the time machine, come to the year 2024 and say, okay, in order for me to have that feeling in a Jewish venue in this way, I've got to do this. You get it? That's the entire thing. But those questions are not the Talmud's concerns. But it seemed to me that this is what needed to be addressed in any contemporary conversation about Jewish prayer. But not only prayer, which is simply an example, all of our inherited literature had to be excavated differently if the goal was tradition as a living faith. Why? Why? Because tourists see the landscape differently than natives. We need an American Judaism because we come to our Judaism as Americans, fully immersed in American culture. The Talmud assumes, we don't assume. Our ancestors entered the world as Jews. They had no choice. That was the pre-modern world where the group defined who you were. Arnie Eisen once said jokingly to me that if in the pre-modern world a Jew woke up and was able to even conceive of the idea not to keep kosher and then followed through on it, they would starve to death because they would have no one left to eat with. To the non-Jewish world, they were simply an other, and the Jewish world could not conceive of eating any differently than the way that their parents had eaten. We moderns, on the other hand, enter the world as individual selves with multiple identities, one of which is English-speaking Americans. Temple Micah people enter the world as NPR listening, Washington Post, New York Times reading, socially politically attuned Washingtonians. We live in a world of multiple identities, but some of them are blasting inside of us all the time. NPR, New York Times, the latest article in Atlantic Magazine, or emailing this stuff back and forth to us all of the time. These things are speaking so loudly inside of us. Some of our identities speak to us in a much softer voice that needs fine-tuning. That is how I came to fully realize the obvious. We need an American Judaism that literally and metaphorically speaks our language so that when we tune to that Jewish station in our heads, we want to stay tuned into it because it is simply so easy to push the button and go to another station or another website, if you will. An American synagogue, therefore, requires what I came to call a translation grammar from all of our inherited language. And here I don't mean simply Hebrew. Every single one of our inherited texts were written in a pre-modern world. In order for them to speak to us, we need different modes of interpretation that ask different questions and a new religious vocabulary that might speak both to our minds and our hearts. In reading Richard Rorty, I stumbled on my next step. Richard Rorty taught, quote, "Speaking differently is the chief instrument of cultural change." We needed to speak differently. We needed new words to explain our religion to ourselves. And we did that. Being Jewish is about the human project. Prayer is an act of identity formation or affirmation. Without a synagogue, we might be spiritually homeless. Faith pushes us to reach for a higher note. Community is about co-creating. We need a new Jewish narrative. And religion is that which enables us to speak in a register that brings dignity to the human condition. This became the gateway to many of the names and handouts that Grace Friday evening service is for week after week, month after month, year after year, and study groups for many years. Rorty, Wittgenstein, Taylor, Nagel, Durkheim, Ricoeur, Geertz, Douglas, Pelican, Berger, Putnam, both Hillary and Robert, Eagleton, Cottingham, Gray, Satlow, Walzer, Postman, Younger, Simon, Tamir, Margalit, Nyman, to name but a few. I wanted us to read together and study anything that would help us gain perspective on what we were trying to do and who we were seeking to be. These thinkers and writers became both part of Temple Micah Shabbat and my Vine newspaper column adventures. Years ago, in a pivotal essay, Rabbi Hoffman challenges American rabbis and synagogue leaders to think about a synagogue as a place of profundity. Hoffman is offering us a new word for the synagogue lexicon, profundity, not a house of prayer or study or social gathering, but profundity. This struck a chord in me, even as I had no sense of what made a place profound. But now, a big pause. Because so often I hear people say that they or we are in search of community. At Micah, people say that they find here in Micah a sense of community and I am never quite certain what this means. What is a sense of community, I wonder? And I wonder what is community and what is sense of community and how do they differ? But I do know this, we never consciously focused on creating a sense of community. And not because I or we were trying to be exclusive or clubby. In fact, at staff meetings, when we have explored other synagogues to learn about them, a common descriptor we find is the phrase warm and welcoming. It consistently gives us a pause. Now, we never wanted to be cold and rejecting, but warm and welcoming we never conceived of as a stated goal. I've come to believe, or at least hope, that we've been able to create what we have here, including even community, because people have found something worthwhile. And community became natural simply because of who we are. After all, isn't Micah's most amazing thing you, the people who are here? Am I the only one who finds really remarkable people here? Smart people, humble people, curious people, caring people, kind people, generous people, people with a sense of humor. I believe that we have a sense of community because we share curiosity, compassion, generosity, humility. What an unhumble thing to say. Synagogue, warm and welcoming, profundity. I worry, are we relevant? My sense was and remains that many Jews have limited or defined expectations of what a synagogue is, and even more challenging than that, limited vision or tolerance for what a synagogue should, could be, and do. And at Micah, we have tried to stretch those preconceptions. I know that there are people who come to us and just don't get us. I also know that Micah is not the place for you if you do not have a sense of humor. That is a real key. My sister-in-law once commented to me that one of the things that makes Micah distinctive for her is that we have a particular Micah language, a shared vocabulary. There's something to get here. I took that as a sign of success because much of American synagogue life felt to me like it was generic. And all of this is in service of that desire for a cultural translation of our Jewish heritage. I used to hear rumors that people counted how often I uttered the word modernity in a sermon. But I was simply being mindful of the Talmud's question about the time for prayer and reaching for a higher note. I was obsessed with the fact that every single inherited text of our tradition, written before the 17th century, was produced by a culture with a radically different worldview than our own. Charles Taylor put it like this, quote, "Why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in, say, 1500 in our Western society, while in 2000, many of us find this not only easy, but inescapable?" End of quote. We read every single so-called traditional text with a totally different set of assumptions than those who composed them, and until the very recent past interpreted them. So I asked myself relentlessly, why do we read these texts at all? What is their claim on us? How do we understand them differently than those who wrote them and read them and interpreted them for hundreds, even thousands of years? I wanted to create a culture of deep inquiry that took little for granted. I wanted to help create a synagogue community that did its best to honor Rabbi Hoffman's teaching, quote, "Reform invented the idea that authentic Judaism is not doing what our ancestors did, but doing what they would have done if they were still alive today," end of quote. In that statement, my teacher is not saying that our ancestors would have created a union for Reform Judaism. I believe that what he is saying is that the language they used, were they writing today, would have been, for example, the language of the Human Project. That's what Rabbi Hoffman meant. If they were writing today, they would have used the language we're trying to create, the language of the Human Project. As I understood that prayer is not a recitation of a theology or rational practice, and that prayers are not essays but poetry, I felt deeply the challenge that meaningful prayer required an ambience that would allow for a suspension of disbelief. The modern American Jew has to be re-enchanted into turning off the cynicism and the I don't believe that button. I came to see more than any one specific thing, tzedek, social justice, Talmud Torah, Jewish learning, tefillah worship. We were together involved in shaping a Micah culture, an environment, a feeling, a desire, transcendence. To be human is to yearn for a sense of joy, uplift, challenge, and purpose in being alive. We needed a tool. Music became more and more the vital tool. And here too we have sought to push the boundaries in search of a musical language that touches our spirits and brings forth joy and tears. We're experiencing it here this evening. We are in an era where, to use another phrase, we find the sacred in the secular and then bring the secular into the sacred, and it becomes ours and religiously Jewish. Just think of last week, Rabbi Slackman and our musical ensemble turning Nina Simone's Turn, Turn, Turn into a Rosh Hashanah theme. Religion is an enterprise of the mind and the heart, and sometimes we need for the heart to conquer the mind. And what is that great rabbinic idiom? We have it. Halev kovesh et harosh. The heart conquers the head. Again, if it's not broken, break it. That's the Micah project. I long to create a distinctive sound for the synagogue that was both understandable as one that would transport us to a different reality. A sound that would help tell us not only who we are, but what we longed to be. I sought to conceive of our Micah worship experience to be akin to stepping into a novel, a great novel, or a great play, where while you are reading the book, or while you are absorbed in the play, that is the reality you are in. And you know my favorite go-to example, reading Harry Potter, Shira Zemel reading Harry Potter. Leave me alone, I want to read the book. Do you really believe in witches and wizards? Of course not, but leave me alone, I want to go back to the book. Great art makes you part of the work of art while you are in it. For more on that, read Suzanne Langer. There is something very subtle here that makes our Judaism so very challenging. We believe, or at least I believe, that none of this was written by God. There is nothing supernatural, so to speak, about my Judaism. The Bible is a work of literature, not a revealed text. All God talk is metaphor. God is a metaphor for that which is totally indescribable and eternally unknowable. In other words, we can say we love God and we cherish doubt. So prayer becomes an exercise in creating a fiction and becoming enveloped in it. I seek for us to forget where we are, to lose a kind of self-consciousness. We enter Paul Ricoeur's second naivete. Then it all washes over us and through us. We might even feel a sense of something that we call sacred. Eternal values become real. In those moments, there really is such a thing as God. There really is such a thing as the Jewish people. There really is such a thing as Sinai when we are inside of it. Do you get it? But then it's over. The worship is finished and we're outside on Nebraska Avenue, if it's Yom Kippur, Wisconsin Avenue, Shabbat, and here's where it gets hard because we've left the bubble. We are now outside the fiction. We're in reality land, but the religious experience we seek has a takeaway for the real world. The fiction has to change us when we meet the outside. What we strong for is for the ambiance that we have created to has informed and helped to define us, because this is what art does. This is our prayer ambition, for it to really count. Torah, in other words, really matters. After all life is sacred. The worker has to be paid fairly. Humiliating someone is absolutely forbidden. The refugee and the stranger have to be welcomed. Therefore, Hineni, Micah House, Sukkot Shalom, Underwear Month, fishing boats for the victims of the tsunami, a truckload of diapers shipped in response to Hurricane Katrina, reading the names each and every week as we stand for Kaddish for those who were murdered in this city, the Micah Israel Fund that supports so many working in Israel for shared society. All this and more are simply tangible manifestations of the Torah culture we have striven to create. We strive for Micah to be a place where we can come to get a deep sense of the reality of this thing we call the human project. So if it wasn't really broken, we simply had to break it. It was just too important not to try to see what we might do together. Slowly, step by step, you've allowed me to learn and to grow. Slowly, my vision has evolved. Our remarkable staff has grown. My incredible young rabbinical colleagues nourish me every single day of my life. They have taught us all so much, and they have refined our collective vision. And together with our amazing staff, we've created with all of you the Micah we have. So for me, Michael's enabled me to have what has been a remarkable career. Thank you. There are way too many thank yous to make. That will be for another time. But please, all of you should know how incredibly grateful I am. As I conclude these remarks, I simply have one person to thank. Louise has been the best life partner a person could have, and Louise has been Micah's best friend and wisest and best critic of Micah's rabbi these past 40 plus years. I don't want to break our Kol Nidre moment, but thank you to Louise simply has to be said by me for all of us. Kol Nidre, our most sacred night, to conclude simply with a prayer. Baruch atah Adonai, shemechabed oti lehiot rav l'kehila kedosha, Temple Micah. Blessed are you, dear God, who has honored me with the opportunity to serve as a rabbi for this sacred community, Temple Micah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shechiyanu v'kiyamanu v'yiyanu lazman hazeh.